Opening the center immediately offers dynamic piece play and challenges black's central ambitions. Prepares d5, a solid foundation for central pawn control and future queenside expansion. Developing this knight fortifies the center and prepares for further pawn expansion. Opening the center aggressively, this pawn thrust challenges white's knight and immediately injects dynamic play. Developing this knight now aims to control central squares and prepare for kingside castling, reinforcing white's grip. Releasing the central tension allows for immediate piece development and potentially opens lines for queenside counterplay. Reclaiming the pawn immediately establishes a central presence, initiating a dynamic struggle for board control and piece activity. Developing the knight to d7 supports a future pawn push on e5 and connects the rooks, a solid piece deployment. The bishop's diagonal aims directly at the uncastled king, creating immediate attacking pressure. Developing this knight towards the center, the knight on f6 offers a subtle challenge to white's centralized pieces while preparing for castling. Aggressively targeting the f7 pawn, this knight maneuver initiates a sharp positional gamble by creating immediate pressure where black's defenses are naturally weakest. Shifting the knight to the d5 outpost firmly establishes a central presence, challenging white's aggressively placed knight on g5 and offering a pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's development. Unlocking the d-file with this pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's central foothold and aims to seize crucial space, potentially preparing for a swift kingside assault or a positional squeeze on the queenside. Asserting space on the queenside is a bold attempt to dislodge that intrusive knight, but it risks weakening the kingside's pawn structure and could lead to unforeseen tactical complications if white correctly exploits the newly opened diagonals. White's knight, having bravely ventured into enemy territory, now retreats, reinforcing the center and preparing for a pawn advance that could open lines. Introducing a knight to b6 significantly challenges white's aggressive piece placement, specifically the bishop on c4, by creating immediate pressure and preparing for a potential pawn push. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's attacking formation and gain valuable central space, forcing white to address the new threat rather than continuing their own initiative. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal opens up an attacking avenue towards the queenside, while simultaneously reinforcing the d4 pawn and preparing for potential central expansion. Developing the bishop actively to attack the knight on e4 while simultaneously freeing the c8 square for future development creates immediate tactical complications and exerts pressure. Reclaiming the knight's central dominion, this maneuver aims to neutralize black's aggressive piece placement and prepare a safer haven for the king, while simultaneously eyeing potential weaknesses around the castled position. Shifting the bishop to the flank, it seeks active participation on the queenside while preparing to defend the king's sanctuary if needed. Finally securing the king's safety, the castling maneuver establishes a crucial defensive perimeter, simultaneously activating the rook for potential central involvement. Preparing to connect the rooks and finally challenge white's center control, black solidifies their pawn structure, creating a solid foundation for future action. Opening up a dynamic central skirmish, this knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential outposts and preparing to launch an assault on black's queenside pawn structure. Sensing an opportunity to solidify central influence and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, black redirects their knight from the less active d7 square, seeking better deployment. This maneuver aims to clear the d7 pawn and prepare for n7b6, allowing the knight to participate more actively in the game. Unleashing a pawn storm, white aggressively contests the center, aiming to cramp black's pieces and gain a significant space advantage on the queenside. Re-establishing its presence in the center, the knight aims to contest the dark squares and prepare for future pawn advances, potentially eyeing the f5 square as a jumping-off point should the situation allow for more aggressive maneuvering. The bishop boldly ventures to the flank, seeking to challenge the dark square control black has so carefully cultivated, aiming to dismantle the pawn chain and potentially open lines towards the kingside. Initiating a central pawn exchange, black aims to simplify the position and potentially gain a foothold on the e5 square if white recaptures. This decision, while seemingly straightforward, introduces a dynamic shift, as it removes a knight that was exerting pressure and offers white an opportunity to reposition their pieces more favorably, potentially opening lines for attack or strengthening their central control. Initiating the demolition of black's central pawn structure is the primary objective now, as white's bishop relocates to a more active diagonal. Thematic focus, * central pawn structure and piece activity. After a series of exchanges, white has seized the opportunity to challenge black's central pawn presence. The capture on e5 by the bishop isn't merely a material exchange. It actively disrupts black's pawn chain, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This move aims to gain a positional advantage by creating weaknesses in black's structure, specifically concerning the d5 square. White's pieces, particularly the knight on g3 and the bishop now on e5, are poised to exploit any further immobility or structural concessions black makes. Consider how this exchange impacts black's development and ability to maintain a cohesive central presence. The question becomes whether black can adequately defend the compromised central pawns, or if white will be able to leverage this structural imbalance for a sustained attack. Shifting the bishop to d6 aims to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's pieces. Focusing attention on the queen side, the white queen prepares to contest the d-file and potentially support an advance of the c-pawn, aiming to restrict black's piece mobility and create a more favorable pawn structure as the game progresses. The king finds a safer haven, tucking away behind the pawn shield, a crucial step in solidifying the monarch's defense before engaging further in the center's brewing storm. Opening the d-file now aims to exploit the slightly passive placement of black's bishop on h7 and potentially put pressure on the king's flank if black is not careful with their pawn structure. Seeking central foothold, black liberates the queen for active duty. An interesting positional concession, trading off a developed bishop for a knight that had been moved back and forth. This decision immediately opens up the d-file and potentially grants black increased central influence. But it also simplifies the pawn structure, which could be a double-edged sword depending on how quickly white can exploit the freer lines. Reclaiming central influence with the queen offers immediate counterplay against white's slightly uncoordinated pieces, aiming to disrupt their attacking ambitions and solidify black's queenside presence. Aggressively seizing the initiative, f4 aims to expand white's central presence and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside, while also preparing for a pawn storm. Opening up lines with this pawn thrust creates immediate friction in the center, forcing a confrontation over the d4 square and questioning white's central pawn structure's integrity. The queen's repositioning creates immediate pressure along the e-file, aiming to exploit the pawn structure's inherent weaknesses and potentially disrupt black's kingside harmony. Exchanging queens here immediately simplifies the position, potentially steering the game towards a more straightforward endgame where piece activity and pawn structure will dictate the outcome, rather than the complexities of open lines and tactical skirmishes. Opening the d-file now decisively creates an immediate imbalance, potentially forcing black into a passive defense as white's pieces look to infiltrate. An intriguing shift to a more open position, forcing the knight onto a potentially vulnerable square to contest central control. The rook infiltrates the 7th rank, creating immediate pressure on the black position and limiting the mobility of the knight. This aggressive positioning hints at a potential for future kingside breakthroughs or a decisive clamp on black's queenside. Capturing that knight on g3 might seem like a natural reaction to the aggressive rook placement, but it opens up a dangerous diagonal for white's bishop and allows their rook to become even more menacing on the 7th rank. Consider the long-term consequences of allowing white's pieces such a direct influence on your queenside, and the potential for a swift attack against your king if you don't adequately defend. Sometimes, preserving material isn't as important as maintaining a solid pawn structure and keeping your king safe. Opening the h-file now grants immediate attacking potential against the black king's defenses, a drastic shift in strategic focus as the queens have been exchanged. This maneuver not only creates a pathway for your rook to become active, but also challenges black's pawn structure directly on the kingside. Consider how this newly exposed line will influence piece placement and future aggressive intentions. Reclaiming the initiative and stabilizing the pawn structure after the exchange on e5 seems to be the immediate aim, with the bishop now looking to reposition and create attacking chances on the queen side. Activating the bishop to its most dynamic diagonal, this maneuver offers a new threat to the queenside pawns, aiming to pry open lines and exploit black's somewhat passive development. Introducing activity into the now open c-file, black repositions the rook, aiming to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially generate counterplay against the king's defenses. Reclaiming the open d-file is paramount, threatening to isolate the black knight on e4 and potentially opening lines towards the kingside, a crucial step in consolidating your material advantage and initiating a decisive attack. The pawn structure has become quite static, and black's decision to trade off the rook on d7 concedes the initiative on the d-file entirely to white. This exchange, while simplifying, arguably gifts white valuable open lines and control over a crucial central corridor, potentially leading to a more passive position for black as the game progresses towards an endgame where white's piece activity might prove decisive. Opening the king's rook to the 7th rank establishes immediate pressure and forces black's hand, aiming to exploit the exposed pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain queenside space, a bold but potentially risky maneuver given the open nature of the resulting position. A surprising regrouping, the bishop retreats, aiming to bolster the e-file and prepare a potential advance for the d-pawn, seeking to crack open the center while black's pieces are somewhat passively placed. Bringing the bishop back to c6 aims to solidify the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential counterplay down the semi-open c-file, while also offering a defensive outpost for the bishop if the c-pawn advances. Sacrificing the rook temporarily opens lines, aiming to exploit black's slightly awkward piece placement and potentially trap the bishop on a4 by controlling the b4 square. Black shores up their pawn chain, preparing to contest the now open c-file and prevent white's rooks from finding a juicy outpost on c7. Securing the monarch becomes paramount, ushering the king into a more active role. Shifting the monarch to a more secure central square, aiming to escape potential skirmishes on the queenside and prepare for a more active role in the impending endgame. Focusing attention on the open d-file, the bishop's positioning here aims to pin down the c6 pawn, creating a strong positional wedge that could restrict black's piece mobility. Swapping off the bishop simplifies the position, offering black a clearer path to equalize by aiming for the d-file. Opening the g-file unleashes immediate pressure, creating a dangerous avenue for the white king to become an active participant in the ensuing skirmishes, a stark contrast to the previously static piece. Unlocking the kingside pawns for potential infiltration, this capture opens a new avenue for dynamic play, though it simultaneously weakens the pawn structure and creates an isolated d-pawn for black. Opening the g-file with this pawn capture decisively breaks open lines that were previously quite blocked, creating new avenues for your rooks to infiltrate black's position. The king's venture into the center now aims to activate this piece, seeking active participation rather than passive defense, while simultaneously challenging white's centralized pawns and potentially creating escape squares from the open lines. Unlocking the f-file for the rook is the immediate strategic thrust, aiming to pressure the weakened kingside pawn structure. Embracing the pawn sacrifice to unravel the queenside structure, black initiates a cascade of exchanges, aiming to activate the stranded knight and challenge white's central pawn majority before it can become a monolithic force. The rook's aggressive dive behind enemy lines injects immediate dynamism, forcing black to confront the open king's file and a potential breakthrough on the 7th rank. Activating the rook on the open d-file now is a logical step, aiming to disrupt white's recently established pawn structure and potentially gain some breathing room for black's pieces. The rook's journey to d8 isn't merely about occupying a central file. It's about creating a dynamic counter-threat against the isolated f-pawn, forcing white to consider its defense and potentially limiting white's aggressive pawn pushes on the king side. This redeployment also subtly prepares for a potential future exchange on d6, aiming to simplify the position and move towards an endgame where black's passed pawns might become more relevant. The king emerges from its defensive shelter, initiating a bold offensive to activate its latent power, aiming to disrupt black's consolidated pawn structure and exploit the open diagonal towards the enemy monarch. A bold thrust aiming to activate the rook and create counterplay along the newly opened g-file, though it leaves the king slightly exposed to a potential diagonal check. Recentralizing the monarch offers a safe haven from the open files and potential pawn threats, preparing for the coming struggles in the center. The rook's return to the 8th rank signals a strategic shift, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pawns and exploit potential weaknesses on the kingside created by the exchange of pieces. The monarch emerges from his sheltered castle, a bold gambit to activate a dormant king and challenge the enemy's positional grip. The rook's return to the d1 square offers a breathing opportunity, repositioning the black army to potentially challenge white's entrenched pawn chain on the kingside and coordinate a more robust defense against the advancing king. Securing the queenside pawn structure gains vital space and limits black's counterplay on that flank, while also preparing a potential queenside expansion. A desperate attempt to disrupt white's consolidated king's safety, forcing a reaction but opening up the king for potential follow-up checks or creating immediate exposure if white plays accurately. The white monarch cautiously repositions, seeking a safer haven amidst the fractured pawn structure. Seizing the initiative with the rook's relocation, this maneuver aims to exploit the exposed white king, forcing a reaction and potentially creating a passed pawn on the kingside if the white monarch cannot safely retreat or defend. The king boldly steps into the fray, no longer content to cower behind pawns, aiming to leverage its newfound activity and shepherd its remaining soldiers toward the center. Seizing the opportunity, black snatches a pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain some material back, though it exposes the king to potential checks along the open files. Initiating a pawn advance to potentially dislodge the adversary's rook and create a passed pawn on the h-file. A precarious rook on the 7th rank is now under direct siege, and the immediate consequence is the loss of white's extra pawn, potentially simplifying into a less favorable position for the side that is ahead. Opening the h-file for the rook is a bold attempt to create counterplay against black's advancing pawns, though it risks exposing the king further and is a race against black's passed rook pawn. The king finds itself out in the open, a stark vulnerability exposed by the pawn structure's breakdown, inviting relentless pressure from the rook and pawn on the 7th rank. Asserting dominance on the d-file, the rook embarks on a daring sortie, aiming to disrupt black's vulnerable kingside pawn structure while simultaneously preventing any hasty pawn pushes from the enemy. Seeking a more active role for the rook. Initiating a regrouping maneuver to reinforce the queenside pawns and prepare for a potential pawn storm. The rook's journey to the 2nd rank is a bid for counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's pawn majority and create downstream threats, though it comes at the cost of ceding the initiative and further passive defense for the moment. Pushing the pawn forward unleashes a potent attack, aiming to break through black's defenses and activate the white king's position for a decisive endgame push. Securing the queenside flank with this pawn advance prepares to untangle the rook and create counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pawns and potentially open lines for active piece play. Sacrificing the pawn opens a critical file and forces the opponent's king into a more exposed position, creating immediate threats. The black king, having shuffled around, now faces a new reality, a stark confrontation with its opponent's pawn advances. This king's dance towards the center, initially a bid for safety, has instead opened up avenues for white's decisive push. The pawn on e6, no longer a mere spectator, is now a powerful instrument of invasion, threatening to dismantle the remaining defensive structure and seize control of crucial squares around the monarch. The situation demands immediate, decisive action to shore up the king's defenses, lest it become utterly exposed. The king's march toward the center, a calculated risk as the queens are gone, now aims to leverage its newfound activity and potentially support the pawns on the queen side. The rook's foray to the second rank aims to disrupt white's now firmly established pawn structure and potentially exploit the open files that the exchange has created, while simultaneously eyeing any weaknesses that might have arisen from white's aggressive pawn push. Pivoting the rook to the c-file aims to challenge black's connected passed pawns, creating a dynamic where white gambles on forcing an exchange to neutralize the immediate pressure. The rook on d2 now finds itself quite isolated on the 7th rank, a vulnerable outpost without pawn support. Seizing initiative with the pawn advance, aiming to disrupt black's defense and potentially create mating threats on the king side. Sacrificing the rook on the 7th rank to pry open the king's defenses proved a masterstroke, and now, confronting that advanced passed pawn directly on the d-file offers black a chance to regroup and consolidate their position. Focusing on the aggressive pawn thrust, white advances the rook to the h-file, aiming to support the passed f-pawn and pressure black's weakened king side further. Pushing the b-pawn aims to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's pieces, potentially opening lines for the rook and freeing the king. Discovering the opponent's king presents a powerful opportunity to force a swift conclusion. The king's flight from its castled haven, forced by the advancing rook, now finds itself in an exposed position, a target ripe for exploitation. The rook now aggressively occupies a key outpost on the 7th rank, disrupting black's pawn structure and creating immediate threats against the king and potential passed pawns. A last-ditch attempt to untangle this tangled pawn structure, though the material deficit makes survival a grim prospect. Reclaiming the open file with the rook immediately addresses the dangerous passed pawn and prepares to contest the queenside advancement. Probing the king's safety on the queen side offers a dynamic approach as the rook's eye critical squares. King mobility unleashed, the monarch boldly steps forward to claim central space, aiming to escort the passed pawn to glory while also keeping an eye on any potential counterplay from the opponent's rook. The black king, exposed and isolated on the king side, finds itself in a perilous position, yet this check offers a momentary reprieve, forcing white's king to concede valuable squares and perhaps disrupt any immediate mating threats. This king's march to the center is all about seizing the initiative and creating counterplay in a tense, balanced endgame. Pushing the rook to f4 creates an interesting dynamic, aiming to challenge white's centralized king and potentially disrupt the pawn structure on the king side by forking the king and the f-pawn. Seizing that pawn opens a critical diagonal for your king, aiming to cut off the black rook's escape. Capturing the pawn with check initiates a sequence that will soon simplify the position considerably, bringing the kings closer to the action in what's evolving into a king and pawn endgame where the passed pawn on the queen side becomes the primary attacking asset for white. The king courageously steps into the fray, seeking to bolster its own defenses and prepare for the pawn's advancement. The king, exposed on the 6th rank, becomes a prime target for a desperate counterattack as the rook swings over to deliver a check. Opening up lines for the rook by sacrificing the pawn creates a dynamic pawn-out-of-position situation, forcing black to decide between defending the weak pawns or actively pursuing the exposed monarch. Unpinning the rook allows black to actively contest the open files and seek counterplay. The rook dances into position, aiming to control the crucial b-file and restrict black's king's movement, while also setting up potential tactics involving the pawn chain. The rook's journey across the board now seeks to infiltrate the 1st rank, aiming to disturb the white king's relative safety and potentially create counterplay against the pawn majority. This move aims to solidify the king's central presence, preparing to support the pawns as they advance. This defensive maneuver attempts to shield the king from further immediate threats by creating a more compact formation, but it also passively concedes the central files to white's rooks, which will likely exploit this space advantage to launch further attacks or advance their pawns. Seizing the open file with the rook fundamentally changes the endgame's character, aiming to exploit the isolated pawn on a6. The king's escape route is now definitively blocked, forcing a painful retreat that sacrifices precious tempo. The monarch is forced into a critical defensive position, creating an immediate opportunity to disrupt black's pawn structure and perhaps force an exchange that simplifies into a winning material advantage. The king's active participation is paramount in this endgame, so bringing it closer to the action provides valuable support and helps consolidate black's position. The rook's descent to the 6th rank creates an immediate, unavoidable check, forcing the black king into a precarious position where its mobility is severely restricted. Seeking refuge for the king behind the pawn wall proves futile, as the rook aggressively probes the 7th rank. The pawn advances, a bold step to seal the king's fate and prepare for a decisive invasion across the board. The rook's relocation to c8 aims to solidify the pawn chain and potentially support a future advance on the queen side, though it also surrenders control of the 7th rank, a common strategic goal. Pioneering the 7th rank with the rook now becomes white's priority as the pawn advances, seeking to disrupt black's coordination and potentially create a passed pawn of its own. The rook's sacrifice on the 6th rank, though seemingly desperate, opens a path for the king to become an active participant in the defense of the pawn structure, aiming to prevent white's queenside majority from advancing unimpeded. Initiating a decisive rook lift to engage the black king's safety from the queenside. King's flight is now completely curtailed, the black monarch finding himself cornered with limited options for escape. The king is forced out into the open, a perilous journey with this check. A desperate attempt to disrupt the encroaching white king, but it's too little, too late. The position is already collapsing. Unleashing the rook along the open file, a potent threat to penetrate black's defenses.